invite you to press some likes and subscribe, because that's what decent people do in this day and age. They go, ooh, I like these people. Like. And we are just beginning here. This is episode 1 of a joint stream podcast that we're launching with independent British journalist Jonathan Fink, who is co-hosting this program from across the, I think it's now officially called the Beautiful Ocean. And I'm here in the great state of Wisconsin, famous for cheeseheads and cheese and beer and all sorts of good things. And we're here to discuss, I guess, the world as we see it from our different vantage points, with a clear priority given to Ukraine. And Jonathan, thank you so much for being my partner in this experiment. How's it going?
It's great. I'm looking forward to this. And of course, when we put these on and we think about how frequently we're going to do it, well, I mean, there's no shortage of things to talk about. Goodness. I mean, this is, I think Lenin said, sometimes nothing happens for years on end, and then sometimes years worth of news happen in the space of a couple of months. Well, we are living through exactly that kind of period now.
Absolutely. And sometimes we feel like we have a long amount of time, but maybe the time is less than we think because, for instance, war in Ukraine. When we look at it from the United States point of view, I feel like we really have a feeling that there's a short event time horizon in terms of how long can Ukraine last without American weapons. And clearly we understand the importance of it because our president just stopped basically giving Ukraine weapons. So interested he is in getting this war done one way or another as quickly as possible. But yet when I speak to people in Ukraine, I get the feeling like they're in it for the long haul. They feel like it's going to be happening for years and years. Russia is always going to be there. They're always going to be resisting. What is your read on this?
I think it's realistic. Now, we remember earlier in the year, Zelenskyy said this to President Trump. He said, look, this isn't going to be over quickly. And he got rather upset because I think we were still in the delusional phase there where he thought he had extraordinary influence over Putin. That turns out not to be the case. And even Trump is starting to realize that he doesn't have that much agency, or at least you won't have any agency if you don't put any pressure on the aggressor. But I think Ukrainians have known this. They've been living with Russia as a neighbor, a conqueror, a colonist, an adversary for quite a number of centuries now. And I think they also have perhaps at various points in history not understood the threat that Muscovy represented, and not understood the strategy of divide, and they get it. And they're trying to teach that to the world. Unfortunately, I'm not sure this lesson is quite sinking in with many politicians.
It seems like even though in the United States the situation is pretty clear and we're just at least trying to raise some public awareness and outrage about what's going on, Europe is now playing a much more important and visible and crucial role in sustaining Ukraine. Are they understanding on the other side of the beautiful ocean the danger, or is this still Europe is still waking up?
I'm told by people who have conversations with those closer to the corridors of power that it is understood that Russia represents a threat. However, I think we have a different problem. That is, we have a lack of leadership and we have a lack of vision. Understanding the problem and dealing with it turns out to be two skills which aren't necessarily present in all the leaders at the moment. We have those countries in greatest proximity to Russia, such as the Baltics and Poland, that not only understand the threat but are actively preparing. But of course, Poland's a large military power. The Baltics are very small countries. They have limited resources and scope in terms of what they can do. And indeed, they are very close to Russia indeed. As you get further west, I think the problem is sort of partially understood, but there does not seem to be the urgency, the scale of preparation required. And I think whereas we have a lot of fine words, including from Merz and Macron, and we have some actions to follow those words, I still think fundamentally that these leaders don't understand the very simple concept that Putin will not stop unless he's stopped. And even if he's stopped in Europe, that won't stop him from unleashing aggression in other places as well that are geographically either bordering or in the so-called perceived sphere of influence of Russia. I don't think this is quite understood. We are not looking at this in a kind of historical dictator paradigm problem. It's still very much viewed as a regional problem, and that hybrid war isn't real war, and that, yeah, Ukraine's going to be able to deal with this forever. Right when I started the channel, we tried to do episodes where we asked experts to imagine a world where Russia won and beat Ukraine. It's an appalling vision if you really take it to its logical conclusions. I'm not sure enough world leaders are really sitting down and doing that mental experiment.
I'm sure they don't, but they're spending their time making sure that Donald Trump feels like he is the king of NATO, and I guess then they feel like, can they possibly think that now their problems are solved? That it seems kind of naive.
It's incredibly naive. I had a conversation about that just earlier today with someone on the one hand who's an expert on NATO and a journalist, so he has to give a sort of balanced sort of view of it all, but he's also ethnic Ukrainian. So there are things he'll say where he has to appear rational and measured and to an extent almost normalize what's going on privately. I think there are many individuals that are terrified, and at the moment they're prepared to do anything to keep the US engaged. So this may look like business as usual. This may look like the usual kind of consensus-led stuff. But what we're seeing is something slightly different. We're seeing countries that are terrified of the US withdrawing and disengaging from the European continent, and they're prepared to acquiesce in almost, build I would call it a NATO Potemkin facade, and they're prepared to,
Oh, that's a scary looking village. Oh, that's a scary looking village.
You won't get a decent borscht in that village, I can tell you. Just better to drive on through. No, they're willing to prop it up, even though NATO is exhibiting, I would say, features of a zombie organization that is past its time and incapable of delivering real action to deter Russia. Nonetheless, I think countries are coalescing together to avoid the worst case scenario. And at the moment, the worst case scenario for them is not Ukraine suffering. The worst case scenario for them is the US withdrawing its forces in their entirety from Europe and deciding that it's done with NATO. That is almost certainly what they are rallying to prevent at the moment.
It seems like on one hand, it's inevitable. It's frankly part of Project 2025. So this is part of Trump agenda. And if NATO would like to make it nicer and more peaceful, that's up to them. This transition of the United States off the European continent. But it seems to me that there's a kind of a missing of the boat situation here where Ukraine can potentially be that defense force, is already that defense force for Europe against Russian aggression, far more than the United States. So maybe this whole dynamic where American president says, let's drop Ukraine, let's let Putin have Ukraine. It's, whatever, he's got his reasons. He hates them so much, whatever, weirdo. But I will hear, if you lick my behind, I will protect you little NATO countries from the terrible wolf of Vladimir Putin, who is just going around looking at you going, ooh, he's going to bite you. But I, Donald Trump, the great Trump, will protect you. Which is really kind of spinning around, like I said, the situation where Ukraine is the real defense. And well, the United States has been the armaments factory. That's great, but maybe there will be others in Europe.
Well, that's it. There's two things there that the US is saying one thing. I think Trump is having to sort of, well, he seems to flip-flop. One day it's this, one day it's that, one day, I speak to a Ukrainian journalist and, well, maybe we'll give you Patriots. And then a few days later, the ones that were in transit get sort of, stopped. And a few days later, well, maybe we'll reconsider, maybe we won't. This, by Trump's detractors, is ascribed to his senility, frankly, and he's not having a clue about what's going on. But I think that's to underestimate what's going on. They blamed Hegseth for stopping these arms, but I don't think Hegseth would do anything without approval of the boss. If we look at it a little bit like a vertical of power, it's highly likely. I mean, maybe they're interpreting the mood music of the top boss, but I think it's unlikely they will go away and do that unilaterally. So what we're seeing here is a policy that is extremely not just appeasing of Russia, but enabling of Russian aggression. Putin would be in a very sticky situation, I think, now, if not just the US, but all the allies had plugged the gaps in sanctions, taken a harder line against the Grey Fleet, handed over more of that central bank assets, doubled down on secondary sanctions, which Biden had just started to do before he left office, and kept the flow of arms going. Putin's economy would be in a parlous state. If secondary sanctions are enforced against India, China, and others, and even the sanctions that Lindsey Graham has put on the table, if those were actually implemented, then Putin would be in a degree of trouble. Unfortunately, all the evidence suggests that that is not what's going to happen. All the evidence suggests that Trump is looking to lift the Western boot off Putin's windpipe and just give him a bit more leeway to see if his special military operation can deliver a victory. That comes back to the Ukrainian front. I don't think, from what I can tell, Putin will achieve any great victories. But at the same time, Ukrainians are not infinite. Their resources are not infinite. And if allies are deprioritizing Ukrainian support over their own, protecting their own backsides, as you said, then we could be entering quite a risky phase of the war this year, especially if Putin sees the window closing on a potential victory. He may well throw an awful lot more at this. And then we should come to China after that. But I'll let you jump in on that, and then we'll tackle the rather indecent, undiplomatic comments that one of the Chinese foreign officials let slip in Europe.
I think that's an important point, because certainly in Ukraine, I see that point being discussed quite a bit, and people are saying that isn't the United States paying attention to the fact that China says that they cannot let Russia lose, and so on. And I feel like the United States is currently underwater like Texas, and it's a different level of concern that we have for different comments. But I also would like to, before that, I would like to get your take. Something that's been bothering me is the things that are being listed in all these articles I'm reading that list all the things that levers of influence and pressure that are available to Western countries, that only if they would choose to use them. But we see again and again they don't. To what extent does it even make sense to describe all the levers of influence that, the sanctions that can damage the shadow fleet and everything, when we see lack of desire to do that? Is that maybe should be the main focus? I'm not even saying about the really big, angry article in New York Times by Jake Sullivan demanding that we give Ukraine back the aid. This is a crazy world. What do you pay attention to in this?
Well, I tend not to read anything that Jake Sullivan says, unfortunately, because I've done that already, and now he doesn't have any power. He can say whatever he likes. His behavior in office was pretty dire, it has to be said. Although those who say that Jake Sullivan and suggest that it was he who was culpable for it. No, he was simply interpreting a policy handed down by Biden. He was implementing what he thought Biden wanted. He was implementing, I think, the tone and substance of the foreign policy that Biden mandated. So I don't think we can see Sullivan independent from Biden. To single him out is sort of perhaps not fair there. He wasn't making these decisions.
But even that, to me, is a very important, very important that, yes, okay, so Sullivan is Biden. That's not even really the question, because to me, that article says that this is the Democratic elites that are offering the alternative to the Trump vision of the foreign policy, where Trump just says, take it away from Ukraine. The Democratic answer is, let's give them back the teaspoon. Sorry, and that's just seems like that's the dynamic.
I think we had it in the last episode too. Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, it's homeopathic remedy under Trump compared to half doses of medicine under Biden. I think what's interesting when we come to the China remark is China has said that under no circumstances will they allow Russia to lose. They pointedly not mention victory. Well, this reminds me completely of Biden Sullivan. They said the same thing. Ukraine cannot be allowed to fall, never once articulating what victory would look like or how we would support them to victory. Here's an irony that we don't want the democratic world to collapse. China doesn't want the authoritarian world to collapse. But perhaps China is not as all in as we might think, just in the way that we are not all in for a Ukrainian victory.
Jonathan, we have a clearly audio issue. I think on your side, it has been pointed out by a couple of our commenters that there's a crackling. So let's address that so that our wonderful audience can feel that they're getting their money's worth. It's free. But thank you for your time spending it with us. We do appreciate it. Press like and subscribe. And, that's what, on one hand, you're going to be certain that you're not getting outdated material. On the other hand, we're doing our best to deal with all the technical issues that we have. It's, if I'm the only one hearing the crackling, that's okay. But if our listeners are hearing it as well, then that requires our technical attention. So let's hope. How's it on your end?
I can sort of hear it in my ear as well.
Okay. Nonetheless, do you think that this statement from China is a real wake-up call for anybody but Ukrainians? Is this something that Europeans should take really see that as an important key point?
I think so. Yeah, I'm going to try and change microphones if the crackling is still going on. But no one is articulating what needs to happen for victory. No one is applying Ukraine for victory. No one is talking at this point about closing the skies. I think at a minimum, if we were minded to simply contain Russia, then we would need to commit to closing the skies over Western Ukraine. That is, in my view, something we should have done straight after the Battle of Kiev was won and Russians pushed back. We haven't taken those steps. We haven't prepared for those steps. Apparently sounds fixed, yes. Unplug it and plug it back in again seems to work. Closing the skies. I think boots on the ground is too complicated. There's far too many difficulties there. Having special forces, having training forces in Ukraine is one thing. Having large numbers of troops is quite another. And Russia would target them. It would seek to create an incident, and it would seek to create division amongst Western allies. But I think the impact on Ukrainian morale for closing the skies would be enormous, and it would send a very clear signal to Putin, which is you can carry on fighting, but you will not win. And I think that would perhaps change a little bit of his calculations. But at the moment, we're doing nothing to convince him that he needs to rethink his ambitions.
Well, but then you're kind of suggesting a Jake Sullivan approach of let's raise Putin's costs so that he stops doing this when we know that doesn't work.
Well, that's we haven't tried it yet. We haven't tried it, and we haven't defined what cost is genuinely painful for him. You know, the costs we've been imposing, we thought they're punitive because we've misinterpreted both the Russian regime and the Russian people. It's just that we have not found a level high enough whereby that cost really starts to bite. That isn't to say there is no such level. I think there probably is.
That's a good point. We have a viewer who writes, the question would be how far China will go to prevent Russia from losing, and what will China do if the Russian economy collapses?
That's a good question, isn't it? I think China's been rather deft at using intermediaries and proxies. So North Korea would not be supplying troops to Russia. And I think those troops were important in pushing Ukraine out of Kursk. That was the initial sort of 10 to 14,000 that was rumored. It is now said that around 30,000 combat troops, in addition, may be sent by North Korea, plus 20,000 workers, engineers and so on, to help Russia scale up its manufacturing of Shaheeds and drones. So interestingly, I haven't really seen any newspapers do the maths on this. Not too difficult here. 50,000 North Koreans being sent to bolster Russia's war effort. I think we must assume that that comes with the tacit approval of China. So that's already one concrete step to ensure that Russia doesn't lose. But there could be more. There are rumors that Laos is being persuaded to send troops. Russia is sucking up people from all over what used to be called the Third World, is now called the Global South. There are Russian recruitment campaigns right across sub-Saharan Africa. Again, China operates economically in many of the same areas. If they objected to it, then they would stop it. The fact they haven't means they don't. How far they go? Well, I don't think China's in any position to prop up the Russian economy from a catastrophic collapse. By buying Russian oil, they are already propping the economy up to a great extent and risking secondary sanctions. But they're also getting a good deal out of it. They're also getting oil at an extraordinary low rate, as is India. So I think they're doing a lot. But they don't have the power. In fact, we don't have the power to stop a collapse in the Russian economic and political system. We just don't. And we shouldn't really kid ourselves that we do. A question then becomes whether such a collapse is a probability or even an inevitability.
It is. And I think that there's been some interesting news coming out of Russia, which is hard to judge because statistics out of a fascist state are, notoriously unreliable. But it seems like the recession might be inevitable unless you ask Putin, which I believe forbid it. So I guess there will be no recession. Everything's going to be great in Russia. Make Russia great again. But there seems to be anecdotal evidence and others that the sales of cars in Russia are down year over year, over last year, and other things that people are not doing so well. It seems like Russia found its solution. They're going to be a military economy. They were going to have just financing the war, and it was going to work great. Now it doesn't seem like it's working so well for, maybe for long term. It's not, it's designed for, today, tomorrow. And then were they not thinking about what was going to happen? Are they maybe surprised there too? And maybe they will have some unintended consequences of a long war that is destroying Russian economy. And I don't see how China could at that point save Russia beyond just including it within China. Maybe that's the way to save Russia, is just to call it China. I think that defending Russia is one thing and withstanding United States is another. But China at the same time last I heard, is interested in Taiwan. And I think on that level, supporting Russia is fundamentally crucial. Because attacks by Russia and trying to absorb Ukraine is, the same idea that would be spreading all over the place. So I think that ideologically, China might not be able to let Russia lose as well, but to what extent they're able to stop it, I think to maybe a greater extent than we suspect, due to the extreme tolerance to suffering by Russian or people of Russia. Who might not be, it's a old joke about we have less money, daddy. Does it mean that you'll be drinking less? No, daughter, that means you'll be eating less. Russia will still spend its money for war effort, and comparing a collapsing economy by consumer economy standards, maybe we should compare it by North Korean standards. And then by that logic, how is Russia doing? Not too bad. By Afghanistan records, comparison, not too bad. So maybe we're just comparing Russia by different standards.
This is the big debate, isn't it? Whether Russians are going to put up with becoming a North Korean-style country economically and politically. My guess is that is not what the so-called oligarchs sort of go to bed and dream about. Waking up in North Korea, or Slavic North Korea. But when you get out into the provinces where there are, next to no opportunities, and you're living in an extremely harsh and punitive environment, I would say many people traumatized it'd be out in the countryside, Russian villages, small towns, etc. The war has been transformational. Just imagine, your husband, who you may like or you may loathe, who may drink away your wages or may not, may beat you to within an inch of your life regularly when he's on booze. He may not everyone's like that. You suddenly get the opportunity where he can sign a contract with the military and earn 3 years worth of salary just by putting his name on the dotted line. Who's to say there aren't people in the West who'd be rather tempted by that same offer? And if, God forbid, he doesn't come back again to drink the money away, you get an even bigger sum. Plus, you get the the status of the widow of a hero of whatever they are calling it these days. And you get some elevated status. Your husband might have been a criminal. He might have been a thief. He might have been a murderer. But he's let out of prison. And if he dies, then he gets some sort of hero of the fatherland kind of status. This stuff sounds ludicrous, but you know what? I mean, this probably actually counts for something in a small village or small town community. You got money, you got status, you got all the things you didn't have before. You might have a nice microwave, etc. What's not to love? There are hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have been transformed for the better by their participation in murdering Ukrainians.
We have a viewer who writes, Petersburg is having problems with rising water. I read today, I don't mind. More rain wanted. I would like to just remind Grunge Thing that, again, you're thinking about Russia here, and they don't care. If it floods, if people die, they had the great honor of living in Russia. And what else can one ask for? And exactly like Jonathan, like you described the situation about compensation for serving in a special military operation, it kind of explains why there's an upswing in patriotic fervor from all these women who are turning in their husbands. Go serve, do a good thing for your country. It's great. And then exactly like you said, if he doesn't come back, then it's just one upside after another. How do you feel about, well, let's see, what have we discussed? We looked at China. We looked at, we're always looking at Ukraine. United States. Oh, boy. Oh, boy. I don't know, Jonathan.
Can of worms.
Across the beautiful ocean now, I feel like it's going to be officially renamed into that pretty soon. How are United States looking from across so far away?
It's, the inevitable ejection of Musk from the administration provided a little bit of it, brief respite and entertainment, it has to be said. And now he's popped up and he's creating his America Party. I think the irony of an oligarch from South Africa who has relatives who were frankly Nazis. I mean, not figurative ones, literal members of the Nazi Party of Canada, I think it was, his father-in-law or something like that. The irony of him creating an American party, which is supposed to embody all the patriotic values, it's beyond dystopian. You know, I mean, my favorite author is still, although he's no longer with us, is Philip K. Dick, an absolutely extraordinary science fiction fantasy. A lot of them were drug imbued because frankly he was on an awful lot of substances when he wrote a lot of them. And when you enter the world of his books, everything's turned upside down. It's hallucinatory, bizarre. Unfortunately, the world is coming to resemble the imagination of Philip K. Dick. That's what I feel the US is descending into. It's descending into a sort of dystopian, utterly surreal world where almost nothing seems to make sense unless you look at it through the lens of extreme fantastical fiction. But this is maybe what Russia wants. You know, I mean, part of its strategy is to disentangle you from any sense of reality or any agency in your life, to create extreme disorientation. I think that feels like what we're experiencing looking at the US. But I have to say, it's not just the US. We have the rise of our own little mini Trump here, as I think of him. Not Boris Johnson, who many people think, you know, with the hair and stuff, bears a superficial resemblance, and of course he's chaotic man. And no, we have someone called Nigel Farage, who is, I think, has his own mini Trumpian revolution planned here as well. With my cynical hat
it's
on,
so interesting because in other countries, they look at Trump and go, oh, we better organize against this. And in the United States, we look at this and go, oh, there's some good things about this. It's kind of disconcerting that other people are looking at this as a reason to get together and organize to stand against it. And we are, you know, just kind of still debating whether there's more pro and more. I mean, you know, it is illegal to cross the border. So I guess maybe we should put them all in cages. You know, it's a crazy conversation that we're having. I feel like, you know, it's a fail of Christianity, really, for starters. And a recent poll showed, you might find this interesting, that many Americans have no clue why we separated from Great Britain.
I mean, I could say, you know, why that was a bad move to start with. You'd have been far better off, you know. Only joking there. I mean, Britain benefited from the US becoming independent. Our trade with an independent US went massively up. We gained far more from trading openly with our ex-colony than when we were trying to sort of squeeze it for taxes. So sometimes things that don't appear logical prior to them happening have a way of creating sort of extraordinary opportunities. We are, however, seeing, I think, a process in reverse here, which is not the politics of hope, the politics of the future, the sort of the win-win scenario, the great sort of expanding of the imagination that industrialism brought about, the idea that you can take your finite resources and finite population and you can create almost infinite wealth with it. That's what we were able to do decade after decade with that kind of open mentality. I feel that now a new mentality is taking hold, one that far more resembles the Russian system and way of thinking, which is something built on resentment. It's built on the idea that resources are scarce and you have to screw somebody over to get those resources. It doesn't really understand the idea that through cooperation and trust, you can multiply your resources and scale them beyond what you could possibly do as a population and based on your landmass. So we're going backwards dramatically, I think, not just in terms of politics, but in terms of our conception of wealth generation, trust, and opportunity. That's extremely dangerous because it's it's very difficult to reverse such a course as that. Now, Ukraine, I think, provides a great example of a country that was under the yoke of a system with that kind of negative mindset for decades, if not hundreds of years, and they've been able to retain something of their agency, their sort of forward-looking mindset, their belief in the future, and their belief in making life better, and cooperation. So it's not impossible, and I think Ukraine provides a great example. But when something as big as the US starts to feed off resentment for the energy to power its politics rather than hope, that's an extremely dangerous moment.
I think an important part here is relationship and view of objective reality, because an important part of a Trump vision and being a Trump supporter is saying that 2 + 2 equals whatever President Trump said today. And if you are arguing about this and saying, well, 2 + 2 clearly equals 4, well, then you are not a true Trumper, because you are asking too many questions. And I think that it's showcased, but when this point of view of this, the king is the king is clearly naked, but he clearly feels very well dressed and fashionable. If you are actually naked in a situation where you can freeze your butt off, then you're going to quickly notice that you're well underdressed. And that's why I feel that Trump approach doesn't really work in a war environment where you can't say, I don't see the danger will kill you. So that's, but at the same time, it's this great desire that if President Trump said this is the way it is, it's just easier to say it is the same way. Who wants to argue? But now we're seeing a terrible tragedy unfold in Texas, where there's already, besides blaming everybody, starting with Musk, because of course, who can we blame now if you're a Republican? Musk. But there's a Republican lady who is running for Congress who already announced that this terrible flood in Texas is all fake. This is all fake news. It was all made up. I mean, to me, that's a classic future of Trump policy. But apparently in the United States, even if there's a flood, you can ignore that. In Ukraine, you can't. But in the United States, as we have one viewer here who wrote that the United States seems to be under some sort of mass psychosis. It seems kind of contagious. It seems contagious, and I feel like part of the reason for my channel, a humble channel in this YouTube space, is to remind, especially in Russian, because most of my work is in Russian, is to remind normal, reasonable people that they are not the ones who are crazy. That the crazy people are all these around who are saying 2 + 2 equals whatever, and that the flood in Texas is fake. And just because that's majority of people, because most Russian speakers are Trump supporters, or at least consider themselves conservative by American standards and have this love for Ronald Reagan, it doesn't really work. So it's a process that we're going through, but mass psychosis seems to be contagious. So I think it seems like something, the service that you do, that I do, is just telling people, no, reality is 2 + 2 is 4, still all day long.
Yep. And there's a lot of that. I mean, just looking at his face, and people are going to find this, maybe ageist, maybe something else. The guy is orange, right? You can see the bits where the orange end. He's bright orange. And I have to look at it every day and go like, this is not normal. He's orange. And yet, it's the emperor being sort of naked bit. I think a lot of people just, you start to filter it out and you consider it normal. There's nothing normal about what he says and what he does. Occasionally it's entertaining in a kind of really sick and macabre way. But of course, as you say now, the floods in Texas, I don't want to belittle those, because it doesn't matter what political persuasion people are. When they experience a tragedy like that, it's a terrible, awful human tragedy. None of them deserve that, even if every single one of them, and actually many of them are children, so they don't vote, but even if all of their friends and parents and family and everybody voted Trump, none of them deserved to experience that level of suffering and trauma. But as you
That
say,
is an interesting point, because I think it's a debate that we're having in the United States of what is the level of suffering that Trump supporters need to experience in order to understand that this was a bad idea.
yes, and I would not wish that level of suffering on anybody,
On
despite
anybody, right?
their
This is far
their
beyond.
terrible
It's
terrible decisions. Now, rather than suffering, I would wish some moment of enlightenment to befall them. Some lightning bolt strike, and it's like, oh my God, did I believe all of this stuff? Because unfortunately, the Russian case seems to tell us that trauma and suffering can be turned into political power. It doesn't necessarily turn things around and make people change their point of view. Sometimes it can retrench terrible points of view. And I just had someone just yesterday write a comment on my channel. It was well-meaning, and it was like, thank you for bringing Russian voices onto the channel. I really miss Russian literature and being able to just talk openly about it, this person said. And I really miss it because it has such beauty in tragedy and stuff. And he started opining about Russian literature, and a little part of me was like, do you know what? I would take the lack of tragedy over the literature any day. Like you could burn all the literature and destroy it. If you could swap that for people having a decent life and being humane to each other, then we could forego the literature.
I believe that is actually a quote from Dostoevsky, who said that a tear of one child is not worth all the suffering, and all the great Russian literature is not worth the suffering that it's sharing with us.
This is it.
Interesting point. I just think about Russian literature that it is so terribly censored, like all of it. Like Russian culture is like Putin approved. And like, why would I value things that are Putin approved? Because we're not talking about, I'm talking about collective Putin, who has ruled Russia for, I don't know, 500 years. And there's always been censorship from the Tsar. And we know this about, how Pushkin struggled against the censorship, and different people, and they try to work with it and work against it. But it's what has affected fundamentally all of Russian culture. So we are not looking at something that is authentic. We are looking at something that is entirely contrived to fit an ideology, and we're buying it. And because Russia had a good period in the 19th century and part of 20th century where they had a good streak of writers, well, that form of kind of art was valued. That doesn't mean that it's authentic, and we can learn lessons that we can learn from this. I was frankly relieved when Dostoevsky was used by the villain in what's the movie with Michael Keaton, Beetlejuice 2. Turned out that the evil guy who is reading Dostoevsky, there's some bad things there behind him. But I think that Russian literature, there's a lot of Russian speakers who love Russian literature, and they feel like this is all big part of dealing with being misinformed for a long time. I feel because Russian-speaking people have this whole history of Russia in the world that's made up, that lives in their heads, that they try to project onto current events, not understanding that their whole foundation is fed to them through censored history, through censored literature, and therefore, and also there's no critical thinking because there's no asking questions about Dostoevsky. There's just either you get it, you got the right answer, or you're wrong. And that, of course, leads to healthy debates in schools. So I think that people who are, hell-bent on any sort of, literature, including Russian literature, just remember that you're consuming, it's like not maybe McDonald's, but it's not real. It's something that somebody had to write in order to fit somebody else's expectations, but now we're buying it.
This is it. And, you don't see the British Prime Minister running around sort of, justifying foreign policy.
Shakespeare.
Jane Austen. Well, yeah, we have Jane Austen, therefore we can steal all your stuff.
That's great. Never thought of that. Yeah, Jane Austen clearly justifies having that. That's a great author.
Absolutely does. But you know, the weaponization of Russian literature has led to exactly this. And I don't think you can necessarily blame the authors for how their works are manipulated and used and instrumentalized. And one has to accept that there are many, many writers who don't fit the canon and don't fit, you know, that they can't become a weapon or a tool. And conveniently, those writers kind of disappear from the pages of popular history, you know, and not known by the majority of people. One of my favorite ones is, well, this was my tutor at university, who was a great fan of someone called Boris Pinyak, who I think almost no one outside of, you know, the refined sort of cloisters of Russian departments and those that specialize in the 1930s specifically will have heard of him. But you know, Russia censors its own culture. It destroys its own culture. It also destroys other cultures around it. I think of it almost like a slash and burn technique, where you see these greats of Russian literature, you know, how do they stand alone, shining like that on the horizon? It's because all the other trees have been chopped down. That's how you can see them, because the land has been cleared to make space for them, so they get all the oxygen. And that's the other thing that I think is forgotten. My favorite quote of Boris Pilyak, you know, you had all these poets like Mandelstam and others who were writing letters to Stalin, imploring for their works to be published or for their lives to be saved. That wasn't for Boris Pilyak. He just wrote the immortal line that the revolution smells of genitals, and he was taken out and shot.
We have a viewer who is asking a question that actually I asked the AI, and I have an answer. So Rachel asks, how censored was Gogol in different eras? I will summarize. First, self-censorship. Second, state censorship and oversight. Third, ideological censorship after death. To summarize, Gogol wasn't banned outright, but he was pressured, reshaped, and constrained, both by the Tsarist censor and by internalized fear of crossing the line. His tragic shift from sharp satirist to conflicted moralist reflects that tension. So, yeah, there's no good examples, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, no. And one also remembers, as I'm sure Rachel is making the point here, I mean, he is Ukrainian. He was already treading a very fine line. But I did speak to someone who is a bit of an expert on Gogol and Shevchenko, and there's always positioned this idea, and Ukrainians do this as well, that here's Gogol, he's sold out. He adopted the language of the empire. He wrote stories that very much focused on the Russian theme, which is the small person, the small cog in the machine, etc. And it's always positioned as Shevchenko versus Gogol. Here's an example of a great nationalist writer versus one who sold out. That's not necessarily the view at the time. There's this letter apparently that was mistranslated, and this chap was telling me earlier in the year. He said, read this letter with huge excitement because this conversation between Shevchenko and Gogol, where basically Shevchenko says, we are performing the same task, each in our own ways. They had an idea of the common purpose that they actually had, not that they were necessarily in conflict. And I think, you know, I think Ukrainians may come to embrace Gogol more because his satire gets to the heart of the Russian imperial disease. It takes it apart with humor and satire, but it gets to the very essence of it. And I think I see his works as being anti-imperialist at their heart. But it also provides a kind of soul or spirit to Russian literature. Ironic that came from Ukraine. Ukraine is I think the soul and heart of the Russian Empire, and now, you know, Russia is a cold and heartless place as it sort of consumes its neighbors.
Isn't that what a visual? I thought of Russia as this dead zombie trying to put its beating heart back in its body. It doesn't work like that. Jonathan, thank you so much. I think that for a first take, first experiment, the first issue of our long-running podcast, this was a great start, and we even figured out how to get the mics working, and I think it's going to get only better from here. I want to thank everyone who's been watching us, and thank those that subscribing both to Silicon Curtain, which is a long-established channel, and this stream is happening specifically not just on Silicon Curtain, but also on Rashkin Report in English, because even though, like I said, most of my work now is in Russian, I do at least a couple of interviews in English that I give to Channel 24 in Ukraine. Please forgive their English pronunciation. They're doing the best they can, and it allows me to give my take. So subscribe to Rashkin Report in English, and always watch the Silicon Curtain. So thank you to Jonathan. You have some great interviews, Nevzorov among many, and really definitely worth watching and subscribing to Silicon Curtain. Thank you so much.
I should mention the story that I actually used in the thumbnail, because I realize I haven't mentioned it, which means people will watch the whole episode and go like, why is the thumbnail like that? The interesting story that I very quickly want to touch on is this pressure. You started saying, well, what is the pressure? What is the price? Well, one of the pressures that Ukraine is exerting is to send drones to close down Russian airports, which apparently has already cost Russian airlines hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue, which they could little afford anyway, given the pressures on air travel at the moment. The fact that they can't fly to Western destinations. So I think this is another clever strategy by Ukraine, but it's also a strategy to bring the war psychologically home to Russians, many of whom in the larger cities are able to pretend that it's not really happening, because they're not really being pressured to join the army. They perhaps under less financial pressure to sign contracts. This kind of brings it home, bringing this inconvenience to their lives.
I think that's a very important point. Back to the point about raising the cost of this war for Putin's regime and for Russia. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Slava Ukraini!
Herojam Slava.